I was associated with, and this was for a leading U.S. apparel manufacturer. And in this case, the customer had contracted with a third-party vendor who was trying to predict the optimal price at which to charge for promotional items in the outlet stores. And so what happened is the vendor, I think like Heath said, one of the common pitfalls that kind of came to the surface here is the entire focus of the program was on the model build phase, and once it got into the actual deployment and execution, that's when some of the challenges for more, I think, which are more common yet elusive, began to surface. And in this case, we didn't involve the business users right at the start of the process. And the business users here, those being impacted by the analytics output, were the store managers. And think about it, these are people who have managed that store for sometimes 20 to 30 years. They believe that they understand the demand function very well in terms of the customers that they happen to serve in that particular vicinity. And as you can imagine, and it did come off as a nasty surprise to the vendor that that particular project did not go very far. Although you might have the most sophisticated models and elegant solutions, I think to the point made earlier, if you don't involve the business users very early in the process, in that planning phase, it's really hard to kind of pull back on that, and more often than not, you're just staring down the barrel. So yeah, and again, I was associated with this project, but there was nothing much that the vendor could actually do to pull back that situation, and the impact was pretty disastrous. Think about the opportunity costs of such a failed implementation. The next time, it goes back to the point we made on culture. How do you overcome that cultural barrier the next time you want to take on such an analytics or a predictive modeling initiative? So I hope that was helpful.
That's fantastic. I know Keith is probably chomping at the bit as I am. I often hog the mic, and I'm going to try to be a little more conservative here, which is not easy for me. To say that I think you raised a number of themes here, three of which I'll see if I can condense a little bit. One of them, I'm going to keep very short. It's just I'm going to toss this one over to Keith. Is he mentioned in his part of the presentation here in the webinar about how if you don't plan in advance for a deployment, there will not be a deployment. A lot of people think that, why would I think about a deployment before I start jumping into the data and applying the algorithms? But you'll end up being misdirected or hitting a target that you never defined as far as how it's going to operate. So I'll refrain from any further detail there, because I know Keith can certainly expand on his experience on what has happened when there is no planning up front for how there will be a deployment. Matter of fact, let me pause on that, and I'll hit on the other two so we have a little more back and forth. Keith, what would you say? And that's a great point. That was, I think, the biggest failing of this was not planning in advance for deployment and probably starting with the collection of the data. Let me pause there, and I'll come back.
Well,
with a couple of ideas.
I would agree, Eric. There's a number of these mistakes that put you in danger of project failure, but that's one of the ones that probably pretty much guarantees it. So a buddy of mine is quite famous within a particular user community, even a software user community, for a famous project because he got an exceptionally high ROI, which I'll say a little bit about in a minute. But basically what he had to do is he had to do a partial rollout to 5% of stores because he was trying to help the stores with their product mix on hand. So the goal of the modeling was to try to figure out what stock they should keep on hand and what they should keep in warehouses, down the road, something that you can easily retrieve, but still it's not literally on the shelf ready to go. So they planned this partial rollout for about 3 or 4 months, and thankfully the modeling was so successful that this outright rebellion that was forming calmed down a great deal, because after halfway through the beta test they realized that it was going to go very well, and actually all the stores were fighting to be part of the experimental group, not the control group, if that makes sense. So I think the moral of the story is you can count on the organizational resistance. It's pretty much guaranteed to happen. And second, it's not a bad idea to plan for a partial rollout, not in response to organizational resistance, but it's just plain good planning in general. So I'll give you the punchline on how successful that project was, which just underscores what a shame it is when organizational resistance brings a project down. Since they were able to stock less and sell more, and it's extremely difficult to do both, achieve both goals simultaneously, that project was worth almost $100 million in the first year.
Yeah.
And the store managers wanted no part of it initially. Of course, they embraced it once it was found to be successful, but unless they had been very careful about that partial rollout, it would have never happened.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, the second part that I'd look at from what Gaurav shared is how so many will have these strategic blunders, maybe assume that they have some successes with the analytics, you know, that they end up with some, like Gaurav said, you know, some results that were elegant. Maybe there was some level of technical accuracy that was impressive, depending on what benchmarks they might have expressed at the beginning of the project. But since it never rolled out, since it maybe didn't have a chance to be effectively deployed, since it was not going to be accepted culturally or a number of other aspects that could have been addressed and planned for in advance, I find where they often improperly dismiss predictive analytics, thinking, well, it's, you know, it's not going to work here, or we gave it a shot, and they're going to have to return to it one day. You can't avoid being data-driven. I mean, what's the purpose of collecting it all and structuring it and cleansing it and storing and moving it just for some self-service analytics for people to be able to reference and visualize some things? So they're going to have to do it at some point. And like you said, Gaurav, there is this delayed gratification. There are suspended opportunity costs that are even more expensive than the salary that had been disposed of for the creation, and any other licensing that might have been prematurely acquired for software and the like. So there's always that risk of improperly dismissing analytics and then further delaying the gains. In the course of our discussion here, I lost my third. I'll see if it comes back to me at some point. Let's go on to a second question here with the you know, little more than 5 minutes we have remaining. Another question that I think is not completely unrelated to this is, how do you change the organization's culture if it's such a big issue when it comes to being data-driven? How do you change the culture to include predictive modeling? And I think training is typically the best way, you know, enlightenment, removing the mystification around analytics. But sometimes you can't cure everything. So, you know, isn't it good to identify in advance where some of those challenges or where the rub is going to be, and can we overcome it? How do we plan for where some of that friction will be instead of encountering it at the end of a significant implementation? Keith, I'll go with you first this time. What have you seen with an organization's culture that could be resolved with many of the things that we address and assess in the assess and plan phase of the MPF?
Well, I'll give two quick items. One really is just to involve people early. I think the reason that, and I hinted at this, you know, with my comments earlier, but I think what happens is folks are afraid to do a big unveil. They want to do the big unveil after the modeling, but then you're in trouble, right? So you have to involve who will ultimately be the end users of the project at the very, very beginning. And then the second thing that I would say is that sometimes when there's this generalized anxiety around these kinds of projects, it's that a certain amount of distrust has built up. There's one organization in particular that I'm thinking of, whereas the ultimate end users of the organization didn't see the data science team as advocates for them. They perceive the data science team as the team that management goes to when they're upset about something, and to put this kind of pseudo-statistical veil on top of management's conclusions. In other words, the data was only there to back up conclusions that were already made, not to let the data, to draw conclusions after looking at the data. Now, I didn't interact with the organization long enough in that particular instance to know how much truth there was to that. But I think that the data science team had found themselves on this treadmill of constantly doing BI reporting, and that's where the perception was happening. Really, the data science team should be this kind of neutral, trusted advisor within the organization that basically just follows the trail that the data is left for them.
That's a great point, and that's where I think a seasoned analytic lead can ensure that different roles on a fully formed analytic project team are leveraged at the right times. One quick example to help keep the model as objective as possible is the role of the subject matter expert. A lot of people feel that they're oftentimes the modeler because they know so much about the problem, but therein lies part of the problem. They're so close to it that and they're such an expert in their field that sometimes they bring in preconceived notions that have been built up over time that aren't necessarily accurate and bring a lot of bias that we don't want built into the model. So having the data science team work with the subject matter expert at the tails of the project, to set up the problem, to define it the right way, to understand how the data was collected, what to trust, what do these outliers mean? We don't just lop them, as Scott had said in the beginning of the event. And then again at the end to help interpret the results. What are these signals we're seeing? What do they mean? How do we get this translated back to the application area? Is just one example of, I think we can avoid bias and tainting an otherwise objective model, which is a tremendous benefit of the analytics that we do. So Gaurav, let me bring this back to you and talk about any other aspects that you can share because we're recording this as well. So even though we have a very small audience at the moment, there is the opportunity for others to reference and play this later. What other kinds of cultural issues and deployment issues have you seen? I know you raised one great example, but even if it's the same example from a different angle, when it comes to the subject matter expert or when it comes to having leadership take part in populating the ideas for analytics or making sure the results are translated in terms that they'll best adopt and understand. Any other aspects that you'd like to share at a strategic level with analytics that you've encountered or that you see as pretty commonplace with what keeps most analytic projects from reaching their potential today?
Sure. So I think it's not uncommon that sometimes you find that the organizations are simply not ready to embrace a data-driven culture into their decision-making processes, both at the strategic as well as the operational level. And we talked about a whole host of pitfalls that might impede the success of such initiatives. We talked about not involving business users early enough and making expensive investments in software earlier on without the right planning and assessment. But I think sometimes what might help is to try and get a better handle on the underlying cause of that resistance, right? Quite often there could be a failed implementation in the past, which has caused that stigma to the types of predictive modeling initiatives. So it's not a bad idea. Maybe sometimes let the data speak for itself. If you can start find a sponsor and on your own time with so that you don't consume a lot of resources. First, of course, start with the problem. If you can identify a problem which is repeatable and identify the right performance metrics or KPIs that we're trying to improve, and then find a sponsor who can kind of sponsor this initiative internally, and then go ahead and build a team, build a on your own dime, run a pilot and show the results and quantify those results and go back to management. That could be pretty powerful. I think another issue is improper management of key stakeholders and political influences, and there's so many reasons, but I think if you can do this kind of pilot and let the success speak for itself, that's a good way to tackle the resistance.
And one thing really stood out with what you had said is the phrase that really caught me was "on your own time," and I think that's one aspect that is under budgeted by leadership when it comes to analytics. Do you find that as well, that even if they pony up funding for, say, a pilot project, and there's reasons why I understand why many times an organization has to put a toe in the water and perform a pilot. I think they have a terrible chance of getting off the ground, because I think they're high risk and low impact when you haven't had the opportunity to look at broader resources, environments, and interview everyone you should to come up with, more project potential, opportunities that then, most of them are invalid, and you come up with a few that are valid and rank them. So I think pilots are a dangerous endeavor, and again, can lead an organization to come to the false conclusion that predictive analytics won't work. But I think one of the things that they don't budget for is time across the analytic team. It's almost like a common side project to tease this out and see what's a potential gain we can get. Do you often see that there's funding appropriated but not time given to a team, that it's more, it has to be on your own type of endeavor?
I think at the outset, sometimes, particularly when, like I said, if there's been a previously failed implementation, or it's you're trying to set up a predictive analytics practice or a function, the time can be an issue to get that initial first win. And then completely agree with what you said, right? The value in actually doing a comprehensive assessment up front, trying to understand more intricacies of the environment, of motivations of different stakeholders, of competing projects. End of the day, you need to be careful before we can ask for a certain. You're not always going to be able to ask for a certain budget to get the project done. So resources, both in terms of financial resources as well as time, I think that's critical. And if you can't muster around, there's always somebody who has some more experience with analytics projects, right? Look within the IT team, look within different business functions. If you can identify that person who's got some experience and would be willing to, make that impact, I think, that's a good place to start.
Right. Yeah, and it takes a lot of business acumen, and I think leadership traits to have somebody, go around the organization in a very purposeful way to gather all they can in order to have the best chance of not just building a successful analytic model, but getting to the point of results that are going to matter to leadership. And before we wrap up, Keith, is there anything else you'd like to offer up or even ask?
No, I think we're ending on a good note.
Okay, very good. And we are a little bit over time. So at 32 after the hour, we'd better draw this event to a close. I'd certainly like to thank our attendees today for your sustained interest, those that made it to the very end here, and for your active participation in the polling, as well as Scott and Keith for their great presentation segments, and Keith, as well as our special guest, Gaurav, for the highly informative Q&A contributions. We'll follow up with an email shortly with some resources and suggestions that will hopefully be useful to you. From there, we hope that you'll consider joining us at a public classroom or live training event soon. Make sure to go to the website and check out the schedule and details for our upcoming productions for the live online experiential courses starting September 25th and December 11th, as well as Dubai on November 19th. On behalf of Scott, Keith, Gaurav, and myself, thank you again for attending Predictive Analytics Failure to Launch. Have a very pleasant afternoon and evening, and this brings the webinar broadcast to a close.